Welcome back. We're talking about the role of military contractors in global conflicts. Joining us here in Washington is Doug Brooks. He's the founder of a leading trade association representing global security firms. International law attorney Scott Horton is a frequent lecturer at Columbia Law School and serves as a contributing editor with Harper's Magazine. And law professor Laura Dickinson's work focuses on human rights, national security, and foreign affairs privatization. Welcome again. Doug, I just want to go back to the Blackwater convictions. 4 Blackwater guards convicted there, they received lengthy prison terms. Is that going to have any kind of an impact on the future use of contractors?
I think it was good from everybody's perspective. I think it's important that we show that there's some accountability. Obviously, any contractor that goes abroad should understand that they're under the rule of law no matter where they go. In this particular case, it was a very complex court case, and yet these individuals were convicted. At least they got their day in court. And I think that's important. We can't assume that these people are going to go there and work without any sort of legal structure applying to them. I think this is something that has been determined internationally. The Montreux document came out, and maybe, Laura, you could talk a bit about that and the importance of that, because that really was important from an industry perspective as well as an international perspective.
Okay, Scott, you've written a book on this. It's called Lords of Secrecy. You say, and I'm quoting here, private security contractors can fill a gap that opens when a democratic government wants to deploy forces to some dangerous corner of the world but does not want to face questions from its population. So basically, are you saying here that the government's off the hook because the government can turn around and say, we didn't order that, we didn't do that, it's a private company that did that?
It's a good thing and it's a bad thing at the same time. So, a good thing because it extends the palette of options they have. Most of us would agree that when the government's going to engage, say, dealing with some humanitarian crisis in some far part of the world, maybe they want to avoid this issue. It may help them with that. It's a bad thing when you're on the slippery slope into a war and you're avoiding the sort of democratic discussion or dialogue that should occur.
I'd just like to say that contractors are here to stay. You can like them or not, but we can't do our job overseas without contractors. And so that's why I think it's really critical that we get the right regime of oversight and accountability in place.
Laura, can I just add one quick point on it? Because this is one example where we use contractors, I think is a very good way, is in terms of training peacekeepers in Africa. So a lot of the Amazon peacekeepers working in Somalia, the Ugandans and Burundians and stuff, get additional training from contractors before they go in. And these are former military people. And it's something that doesn't necessarily, you don't have to send the military, it doesn't have to raise a policy to that level, and yet it's a very good policy that's been going on for decades now.
Right. Laura, getting back to what you said just a moment ago, I mean, what about democratic accountability? I mean, is there any kind of congressional oversight over what contractors do?
Well, there has been some, and the Commission on Wartime Contracting did a tremendous job in highlighting some of the problems and some of the reforms that are needed. The Commission estimated that contractor abuses cost taxpayers more than $30 billion.
If I could just clear, first of all, that number is bizarre, and they've never come up with an explanation where it came from. Second of all, most of that money is very clear, probably well over 90% was waste rather than fraud or abuse. In other words, it was poor decisions by the client, by the government, making duplicative processes, making the wrong things, creating, doing reconstruction in the wrong places. That's very clear. Well, yes, there were some contractor abuses, and those should be addressed.
But the fundamental point, I think, that it's getting at is that we turn to contractors based on the very, very strong argument that this was the cheap and effective alternative. It was better than the traditional form of using uniformed personnel. I don't think a strong evidence case was ever put forward for that. And I think this report, in part, points to that issue.
Well, and this goes to the ideology of privatization and the politics of that. It's much easier politically to add a contractor position and to appropriate funds for that than to appropriate funds for a new governmental position. I'd also like to say that we have made some progress, but we have a lot to do. So, for example, the Defense Department recently announced that it's going to hold all security firms working for the DoD to the new standard called PSC-1 that imposes pretty rigorous requirements on security firms in terms of human rights training, vetting of employees, auditing. So that's good. But here's what's bad.
Also included in the Worldwide Protective Services contract from State Department It also requires PSC1 also membership to the International Code of Conduct Association as well.
Which is a step forward.
Right.
Absolutely.
Doug, there is a broader question here. I mean, we're talking about war. We're talking about a war that is being fought in the name of a country. Uniformed soldiers act in a different way.
Yes.
I mean, private contractors, do they go there? They are not motivated by, let's say, patriotism or some kind of altruistic
They're motivated by
motive.
profit.
By money.
Well,
money.
at
And
the most base, but I think
Yeah.
everybody who went there, I mean, you're going to risk your life, and you better damn well believe that, you know, in what you're doing. But let me just say really quickly, when we're talking about security contractors, they have different rules than the military does, and this is a very, very important point. They are not replacing soldiers. They can't. They can't do the offensive operations. They have soldiers have something called rules of engagement,
Right.
which allows them to use force proactively, lethal force proactively to achieve their mission. For contractors, they have rules for use of force, which are basically three things: self-defense, which everybody can do under international law; protection of whatever's in their contract, that the person, place, or thing that they've been hired to protect; and finally, in most cases, they're allowed to protect civilians under mortal threat. And that's it. So it's a very, very different role from the military. You're not replacing military, you're not replacing soldiers, because you can't, but you're replacing them to do, you're using the civilians essentially to do all ancillary tasks, let's say.
Scott, we had a situation where two US-based corporations, KC and L3 Service, formerly known as the Titan Corporation, were reportedly involved in the torture of detainees at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. I mean, does the hiring of people like them insulate the government, in this case, the United States government?
I think that's a very serious concern here. I mean, I'll say in this case, the circumstances of those contracts, the way these people were deployed, looks very much like an effort to obscure a program that was in place, to make it very, very difficult for criminal investigators to find out what happened and to allocate accountability. And of course, we had a federal appeals court rule that some of these corporations are entitled to the kinds of immunity that we give members of the uniformed services, which I think is one of the most preposterous federal court decisions
I think one thing
I've ever seen.
Everyone has to be clear on: torture is illegal. If you have a government asking contractors to do torture, that's a problem. And if the contractors carry out torture, that's a
But
problem.
accountability.
There are a lot of tort suits out there, and this is actually a really interesting area to watch, and the courts are all over the map.
That's right.
And a number of these cases have settled. So there were cases involving the Blackwater victims, civil tort suits that settled.
Yeah, but is there any circumstance where contractors could get immunity from what they're doing over
Yes.
there?
But they are.
Yeah, they are.
Well,
Some
immunity
courts are
from
giving
some
it to them.
laws, but not from others, essentially.
I mean, there certainly are some federal judges in the United States who seem to believe that there is a federal policy of shielding these military contractors from civil litigation.
I think this is another place where Congress should step
Right.
in and clarify the rules regarding these civil suits, because I think that some measure of tort liability is important. But I want to go back to the oversight issue.
And let me just say that the industry would support clarity.
Right.
I mean, the biggest issue in the industry is liability. And if you have clear laws, it doesn't matter what they say, you can follow that. But when you have a really big gray area, it means you're going to spend a lot of money on litigation.
Right, Laura?
I just want to go back to the oversight issue because we still have a long way to go there. We still struggle to get accurate data on the number of contractors.
Right.
So DoD is pretty good on this, and they provide quarterly reporting on the number of contractors. That's where those numbers came from. The opening segment is from DoD quarterly report. State Department doesn't provide that. There are other contractors as well. I mean, we can't even get a handle on how many contractors are out there. And then we have continuing problems with getting qualified contract oversight personnel into the field so that they can do their job. Another thing is that these...
Can I just touch base on the contractor numbers? You know, I would like to point out, how many contractors did it take to build your house? Or does it matter? In fact, did you get a good house? Does the roof leak or anything else? That's kind of the key issue. However, Congress said we want to know the numbers, and so now they go out and they collect numbers. But if you're doing a construction site and you're hiring a lot of local nationals to do the construction, engineers or day laborers, they may only be there a few hours. Do you count them or do you not count them with the quarterly
But that is
report?
a justifiable request from Congress to
Well,
say...
no,
we
of
want
course,
to know.
and DoD actually does a pretty good job of coming up with numbers, but how accurate are they?
Another
It's really
problem
hard
is
to say.
that the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, or
Right.
SIGIR, the mandate for SIGIR has lapsed. SIGIR provided public reports based on hard data, on-the-ground interviews on what was going on, and it led to really important reforms. Now, we still have the Inspector General for Afghanistan, but I would argue we need a permanent Inspector General for overseas contractors so that we can have a public debate, we can have democratic accountability.
Right.
But I would just point out in terms of oversight, we had that oversight and we had that information when these responsibilities were managed by the Department of Defense and by uniformed personnel. It's the heavy shift to contractors that's resulted in our Congress and our other oversight officials knowing much less about what's being done and how money is being spent. And that's because our capabilities of auditing and controlling private contractors are much weaker than they are for the government itself.
Although the ultimate accountability, you can fire a contractor, you can't fire the Department of Defense.
Well, can you? You know, I think if we can look at Blackwater and look at the struggle that the Department of State, they did fire them, but it certainly took a very long time to do that.
I'd like to actually point out another area where contractors are being used that doesn't get a lot of attention, and that's in the operation of new military technologies like drones.
Right.
To operate a Predator or a Reaper flight, it takes 180 people, and a lot of those people are contractors. And I think it's an area that merits more attention, transparency, and oversight.
I agree with that completely.
Doug, in 2008, there was something like 156,000 contractors in Iraq, 2010, 94,000 contractors in Afghanistan. That trend is going to continue in your view?
Well, it goes up and down. Again, it's way, way down right now. It just depends on what sort of operation. And keep in mind, if you have a choice, most of the contractors are local nationals. They're cheaper, they live at home.
Yeah, I think we should make the difference that they are armed contractors and they are unarmed.
Right, I mean, you want, exactly. Well, even armed contractors are mostly local nationals. You only hire foreigners, they're more expensive, there's liability issues, there's travel issues. You hire local nationals, you train them up, and they're the ones who are doing most of the work. So when you're talking contractors in these large numbers, overwhelmingly they're going to be locals that do this work.
We're going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time. That's it for this edition of The Heat by the